I want to start by going back to Wednesday, November 6th. And there's a uniquely German word that describes how I felt waking up and looking at my phone and reading the news that the Democrats had lost the election. And that word is Schadenfreude. Wikipedia defines that as Schadenfreude as pleasure derived from the misfortune of others, especially seeing immoral or bad people punished. And I think immoral is apt because that's exactly what I think the Democrats continually reveal themselves to be, but I think especially over the past year, that is doubly true. It's true that they might not be as overtly murderous as the Republicans, at least usually, but I think the notion that one could live through the past year or the last 4 years and not want to see the Democrats punished in some way, I think means either you either haven't been paying attention or you may have excused the genocide that they're carrying out. That isn't to say that we should all at all celebrate Trump's victory. I also felt anger, disgust, horror, and a readiness to fight. For many people, there's plenty of disgust, horror, and despair too. As I'll get into in a minute, Trump is an oncoming disaster that we will need to fight. But his return to power is not exactly surprising either. 2024, in many ways, I think feels like a redux of 2016, and not just because of one candidate or the result, but the way society looks and how it's brought us to now disastrous elections, and actually three if you count Joe Biden's election too. Um, so this talk will in this talk I'll go over the conditions briefly that our enemies have overseen, the conditions that led us to Trump 2.0. Then I'll discuss the election and results themselves, and then I'll talk about the kinds of inspiration and action that I think we'll need to take in the coming months. To do a true analysis of the election, we can't just look at exit polls and vote tallies. I think we need to start by looking at the state of society, and that's a Marxist approach for understanding any kind of election, but especially this one. So, the state of the world. Think we can, in shorthand, I think we can say that the old political order, this period since 1975, known as neoliberalism, was defined by U.S. world dominance. All that now is has been on life support, but at the same time, there hasn't been a revolutionary alternative on offer. Trump has stepped into that vacuum. Or to quote Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, the old world is dying and the new one struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And I think that that sums up our situation pretty well. For decades, the US-led global neoliberal order seemed stable. They called it the end of history. But in true dialectical fashion, beneath that stability, changes were happening. China leveraged its sweatshop exports to become superpower number two. Turning to global finance and attacking workers' living standards did help solve the slump of the 1970s for a long period. But these ultimately have reached their limit. Amid multiple intersecting crises of US world hegemony, capitalist profitability, political leadership, been a long period of polarization that started after the 2008 market crash and continues to reign today. Since 2016, Democrats have tried cobbling together the quote unquote adults in the room of various stripes to maintain that old political order. Since 2010, the 2010s, since 2010's Tea Party movement, Republicans have seeded and cultivated more and more radicalized coalitions of crazed petty bourgeois, atomized and desperate workers, capitalist demagogues to shift US society decisively backwards, while more and more turning to economic protectionism and bilateral trade as um, for foreign policy. Both Democrats and Republicans are capitalist parties. Both rely on growing the repressive state. Both have made workers pay for the crises, especially the most repressed sections of the class, like undocumented immigrants. Both seek to shore up and reestablish U.S. imperial order against power against its rivals. Yet between the two of them, the exact tactics and rhetoric generally differ. Starting in the 1970s, with Nixon's Southern strategy, Republicans have used scapegoating to weld white small business people and workers to the capitalist neoliberal agenda. Welfare queens, quote unquote illegals, quote unquote groomers, quote unquote feminazis, and more were trotted out to define a battle between the good, God-fearing, quote unquote deserving citizens on the one side and the supposed freeloaders coming to destroy America, the American way of life on the other. The Democrats, on the other hand, have had to walk a bit of a finer line. Since the 1930s and 1960s, they have presented themselves as the party of the people, supposedly the voice of labor, black people, immigrants, women, LGBTQ plus people, and any other social movement that has sprung up. Yet, they are also in charge of the same neoliberal agenda that has created mass incarceration, expanded the military, attacked workers' living standards, criminalized immigrants, and more. For a long while, Democrats have been able to energize their working class base before the elections and then disappoint it with their real agenda in office, driving apathy and lowering people's expectations. But as crisis and polarization has deepened, the contradiction in the Democratic Party has also deepened, even to the point of denying reality with slogans like, America is already great. This has angered their supposed base and frayed its connections to the nonprofits and unions that are really in charge of mobilizing people to the polls. The Democrats also rely on people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to drum up excitement, but only as quote unquote like radical red bunting on a capitalist party. These progressives and socialists, or what quote unquote socialists, dutifully stay on leash and subordinate. When any social movement or any left-wing alternative springs up, the Democrats have, as they always have, co-opted and helped or to help to repress it, or both. It's not just the Palestine Solidarity Movement today. Um, in over this course of this period, the various waves of Black Lives Matter rebellions have faced crackdowns and defanging. In 2020, there was a huge push to turn the Black Lives Matter George Floyd rebellion into a get out the vote campaign for Biden. It was largely successful. The Obama administration, I think we also should remember, or for those who don't know, coordinated a nationwide crackdown and attack on the Occupy Wall Street movement of 2011, and which was perhaps the first major movement of this period. The mainstream Democratic Party, including figures like Kamala Harris, continues to assume that the left and working class are contained so that they can continue to reach out to wealthier voters on the right. And unfortunately, um, for us, and I guess quote unquote fortunately for the Democratic Party, when it comes to the left, they are largely correct. Um, the left has been and continues to be continually contained and defanged, as we've seen from the Democratic Socialists of America. Um, but regardless of the existing left and the fact that there isn't a real alternative, there without that space for the left to grow, the Republicans have largely been able to position themselves as this sort of mainstream, in some respects, anti-establishment group, even as they've pushed politics that explicitly prop up that very same establishment. Racism, heterosexism, fossil fuel extraction. I think the list could go on, and as including as we saw with this election, immigration as being a huge scapegoating immigration. Um, as these crises have deepened, so has their scapegoating and demagoguery. Unlike the Democrats, they have in this election especially, they have acknowledged an economic crisis exists for working and middle class Rust Belt and rural areas, except, of course, their solution is to punch downward. Leading into November, I think we can say that these dynamics were in full force. The Democrats, wedded to propping up the American empire, couldn't simply co-opt the Palestine movement, so they did their best to repress it, ignore it, shut it out of mainstream political life. They couldn't acknowledge the declining living standards that they themselves were responsible for, hiding behind all their rhetoric about a quote unquote booming economy. Um, Officially, prices are still over 20% higher than before the pandemic. And that also doesn't account for insurance, mortgage rates, and other factors and prices that are not included in the official inflation rate. So you have a party that is so tied to the status quo, and then a right-wing bigoted party that is able to present itself as an anti-establishment force. And this is the context in which we're entering the 2024 election. Um, Ignoring all of the vibes and the coconut memes and all of that, that is sort of the general picture. I'm not going to talk about we all know what happened at the election, as far as who won it. But in the days after the election, we saw that the liberal pundit sphere started talking about a red wave. They published maps showing all the changes in vote percentages to Trump versus 2020. They talked about Trump controlling both houses of Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, but also a majority of the American population. In short, as far as you know, they talked about, anyone to the left of Trump is doomed. It would be doomed. And in addition to that, they did their own form of scapegoating where they've now blamed the Democrats for somehow uh, tracking too far to the left, as if anyone saw them take a firm stand on anything and not, as they did, try to outflank Trump to the right on things like immigration, or in this case, Palestine, as another case, Palestine as well. So, was it a red wave? Are we actually doomed? Um, I mean, rhetorical question. No, I don't think so. Not if we look at the numbers and the voting trends. And, had I think Mark probably is going to be more prepared and has a beautiful slideshow and all of that sort of stuff. I don't. I'm just going off the cuff a little bit here, but um, I think it's important to start by saying before we talk anything about the actual vote tallies, an important point is that as I think many of us know, a huge number of people in this country can't or don't vote. There are, of course, immigrants and those with criminal records who are denied the ballot. But even then, almost 40% of those who can don't vote. And I think, when we go back to that context of this 40-year attack on working class people and living standards and really for a long period, a crystallized social order, an end of history that didn't seem like it was going to change no matter who you voted for. Um, I think some of that abstention and that apathy really is understandable. Um, I want to shift to then now actually let's talk about the the actual numbers and or the actual trends that I saw when I was looking at you know the results from the election. And I think first and foremost, while it's true that for the first time in almost 20 years, the Democrats lost the popular vote, um, it the reality is not a red wave of a huge increase in Trump, uh, Trump and Republican voters. But actually, the reality is that the Democrats lost more votes than Trump gained. And although, with the Electoral College in this country, um, there's only a few states that really matter as far as deciding the election. And with that, some of those counties or some of those states, it really was a few thousand votes here or there. Um, I think one of the things that's really important to look at is that where Democrats lost votes, um, Harris lost, more, but not exclusively, in blue states versus swing states. That is to say that the people in blue states that saw themselves that, saw it as doesn't really matter. There's no point in me voting. Um, and this candidate and this party does not deserve my vote. They stayed home. And I think that when we talk about dynamics in the election, like the role that the Palestine solidarity movement played, or the role of the economy, and where do we sort of put that balance? Um, I think that to me, the fact that a lot of the loss in popular vote came from those blue states suggests that um, Palestine was actually a more significant issue than I think many in the liberal pundit sphere want to admit. Um, but it's also true that, you know, if you look at the exit polls, which only poll people who voted, the economy was a major factor in people's voting. Um, so I think we can say that the people that stayed home might have stayed home because of Palestine or because of another issue. But the people that um, were swayed by, to especially to vote, to switch their vote or um, to come out and vote for Trump, the economy did have a significant impact. Um, Now, it's important to say that despite the Democrats' loss of votes, this does not mean that um, there was a huge rightward shift in the electorate. Because I think if we look at some of the ballot initiatives, like we look at the abortion rights measures, um, including in a place like Florida, which only by the, you know, bureaucratic uh, limits that are placed on ballot initiatives there, won 57% of the vote in a place like Florida with DeSantis. And, you know, I mean, we often laugh about Florida being this bastion of right wingdom, but the reality is that, you know, uh, people are are not so um they're they defy some of the stereotypes of the sort of liberal elitist pundit sphere. It's also true that um, when we talk about immigration and the role that the Democrats have played, as well as the Republicans over the past 4 years, um, it looks a little bit different. That we have seen a shift um, and a way, and it there while there is support for immigrant rights, um, that that public opinion is going in the opposite direction from where we want it to go. So I think that kind of goes over in broad strokes the election results, and I'm sure hopefully when we get into the discussion we can get into a little bit more of the details about that. But I want to shift now to then talk about what are our perspectives moving forward in a very short term perspective. I know Mark is going to talk about um, some more medium to long-term perspectives. So someone might ask, even if the election might not be a red wave, doesn't that still mean that we're doomed, though? Because Trump won the election, he has both houses of Congress and all of that sort of stuff. And I want to, as I keep referencing 2016 as being, this sort of a similar election to this one, I want to just read off something um, that it was written right after 2016, and I think gives you, um, I don't know, tell me if this sounds familiar to you. The Trump presidency dawned with the opposition Democratic Party finding itself at its lowest ebb since the 1920s. The Democrats lost the executive branch, remained minorities in both houses of Congress, and stood to see the Republicans lock in another generation of control of the Supreme Court and U.S. judiciary. At the state level, Republicans controlled 68 of the 99 state legislative bodies and held 33 of 50 governorships. And the Democrats held more than 1,000 fewer state legislative seats than they controlled in 2009. And I think that, you know, there's been so much doom and gloom coming from the liberal world coming out of this election that I think it is important to remember that despite a very similar situation that we had in 2016, um, first of all, uh, Trump, despite all of the acquired power, did not accomplish most of his full agenda. Now, since then, we can say that, um, he certainly solidified and radicalized, uh, a base. Um, and that I think is perhaps the bigger danger. I think that we've seen since 2016, if we want to use 2020 as another sort of milestone, um, the development of the anti-lockdown protests, and then, January 6th, it shows that there is a, to a degree, a mass organized base around Trump, and around the right. Um, and I think it's also important to say that as evidenced by something like Project 2025, although it's not quite the blueprint of exact, a full plan. It's really a document that's a coalition of different forces trying to figure out, what do we do in 2025 if we win the presidency? And some of that stuff is kind of contradictory to one another if you get into the details of it. Um, it's also true, though, that Trump and the Republicans have learned from the last go around. Um, and but at the same time, we do have some examples, both from the first Trump election, but also from others, as we just saw recently with South Korea and the declaration of martial law, and um, you know, not only the left wing in uh, in Congress, which is like what people or their parliament, which is what people are focusing on, but also the call from the South Korean Trade Union Federation to call a general strike if the uh, if the prime minister tried to um, implement martial law, and then also calling for a general strike to demand his resignation, their resignation. Um, and so that's also why, um, you know, as we look back from 2016 into now, um, we can't, unlike the liberals and the Democratic Party, we have to go beyond just all this talk of constitutional safeguards that either for the last 8 years, the Democrats who have tried to go through the institutions to stop Trump, um, or as they're saying now to us, which is like, yeah, 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 uh, it might not seem as bad, but now Trump doesn't have, there's nothing stopping him. There's no constitutional safeguards. I think for us to focus on the lack of these quote unquote constitutional safeguards, I think first both minimizes the mass resistance that was effective, like airport protests when Trump tried to pass the Muslim ban, um, or this general strike example that we saw from just recently from South Korea. So it minimizes that mass resistance and also falls into um, looking to the same failed strategy that the Democrats have used to co-opt anti-Trump sentiment um, started since 2016. That, you know, we have to trust in the institutions. That, to be clear, just happens to be the home turf of the bourgeois political establishment, especially the Democrats. And that somehow that's going to restrain Trump. Um, I think the second point, and I'll just start to finish up on this, that even as the Democrats appear to have collapsed, um, it's important to remember that similar to 2016, they could very easily, again, successfully co-opt the anti-Trump sentiment to rebuild themselves. And ultimately doom us to the repetition times three of what we're now facing today. Right now, they might cravenly leap rightward to absolve themselves from losing the election. Um, like saying it's not Liz Cheney, it's not Liz Cheney's fault we lost. It's because we went quote unquote woke. Um, we should expect that the Democrats and their NGOs will try to place themselves at the head of any resistance to Trump that takes place. Perhaps, maybe with the exception of Palestine solidarity, but even that remains to be seen. Um, so, as revolutionaries, where do we go from here? And I think that first and foremost, it's important for us to all get on the same page about a perspective of what's happening, that we're not entering um, fascism. We're entering a new period that requires, yeah, definitely some caution, but not does not mean that mass resistance is impossible or we should just go underground. Um, I think what it means is that we need to convince people of a perspective that resistance is possible, that we need to that resistance needs to be clearly independent from the Democrats that have gotten us into this mess, and that um, where possible, we should explore the formation of broader fronts and campaigns with other forces that can lay the basis for cohering these forces, first and foremost, to defend our the rights that are going to be attacked, but also lay the groundwork for a real alternative, something that um, can pose, can really reclaim the position that I think the left has traditionally played, which is, you know, against not just the quote unquote corrupt political establishment or the swamp, but actually this whole system that, the swamp or quote unquote this, bourgeois political system is just one part of. I want to just end by saying it's important to recognize that the crises that I mentioned at the beginning, the crises of U.S. hegemony, the crises of profitability, the crisis of U.S. political leadership, none of these are resolved. And while the right has solidified itself around Trump, the left right now, the working class, have coalesced neither their political ideas nor organization. Struggles have provided radicalization, but largely, unfortunately, on the level of individual ideas without an organized, systematic, or collective expression. The opening for organized politics still remains wide, and it is up to us to actually figure out from where we are standing right now, where do we go from here to both fight Trump but also build the left. And I think that's the perspective we need to have.
I want to start by just kind of reframing, what is, when we're talking about long-term goals, what is our long-term goal? Well, our long-term goal is the abolition of capitalism and exploitation and oppression, and establishing, to paraphrase Marx and Engels, the first really human society in history. Our goal is the beginning of human history. Is how I sometimes think about that. So how do we get from where we are to where we want to go? Maybe our most kind of concrete long-term goal is the construction of a revolutionary Marxist party that's capable of a decisive intervention at a moment of revolutionary crisis, right? To carry that struggle forward, and win a new society, abolish the old one. So our strategy when we're talking about different goals and different stages needs to always be connected to that ultimate goal, right? Even when we're talking about like short-term organizing opportunities, talking about where we think different levels of class consciousness exist, and things like that. We need to always approach those as a step on the path toward revolution, right? So in what follows, I'm not going to be arguing for any like major changes in our perspectives, I don't think. If you are a Firebrand member or a person who's been to our meetings in the past, um, this isn't going to shock you that these are the positions I'm putting forward. But I do think it's still important to evaluate those in terms of new political terrain, such as following an election. And I think we do have some new questions to think through. So first, I'm going to go through just some different approaches to maybe the medium term that I think we can expect to run into, some different organizing responses to the second election of Donald Trump. And I'm going to start with the most common sense of them in the way that Gramsci uses that phrase. What Gramsci means by common sense is essentially the general form of thought common to a particular period. And he emphasizes that these are always fragmentary, right? That this is lived experience conflicting with ideology. And in that sense, the most common sense response for people who are dismayed by Trump winning another election is going to be to join the Democratic Party and to try to change the Democratic Party and to try to make it more effective. This is essentially, in other words, what DSA has historically referred to as realigning the Democrats. We need better Democrats. We need to get more progressives, maybe even leftists, into the party. Now, obviously, we're opposed to this solution. This provides, as many communists have said in many elections, this actually provides left cover for the Democratic Party. The more quote unquote good Democrats we succeed in installing in the party, the more that party can present itself as actually representing working people and the oppressed. When folks refer to Sanders during his many candidacies as a sheepdog for the left, this is what they're referring to, is that his real function is to corral people who might leave, and bring them back into the Democratic Party under this left cover. But there's another side to this, which we're seeing right now, and which comrades have alluded to already, and that is that it doesn't just provide left cover, it also provides a ready scapegoat for the Democrats after they lose. So going into an election, the left wing of the party is, okay, come in, look, we are representing you too, you have a voice here. After the election, the left wing of the party, despite having no real influence in any concrete sense on anything the party does, gets hung out to dry. So when Democratic functionaries with such glorious campaigns as Hillary Clinton's failed electoral bid on their resumes come out and say that the problem was that Kamala Harris was too pro-trans rights, despite the obvious evidence of our eyes and our ears, this is what they're doing. They're taking the fact that people who do care about trans rights got involved with the Democrats and using their presence there to make them a scapegoat. So obviously we don't want to take this tack. And also the people right now, especially after this election that we most want to meet, are the people who are fed up with the Democrats. So we don't want to go in as they're leaving. That wouldn't make any sense. We want to be outside the door ready to talk to them. Okay, so moving, I'm going to start with most common sense and kind of move leftward. One step left from that, I think, is joining the DSA. And I'm being a little bit charitable towards the DSA here. Um, because I think people might be frustrated with the Democratic Party. They don't think that going in as a Democrat would make sense. So maybe they'll join DSA and influence the Democratic Party that way. And the same strategic and tactical and political objections, I think, apply here, right? You're orienting political energy towards the Democratic Party. There is another reason why people might join DSA, though, and that is recognizing it as the largest, at least nominally socialist organization in this country by a considerable margin. People might come up with a strategy of getting into DSA to try to improve DSA's politics from the inside. And we see this with various caucuses in DSA, various minority positions and blogs and so forth. And this, you can see how people come to this conclusion, right? The DSA right now, at least based on reports that I've heard, I can't back them up particularly, is that meeting attendance has increased by a considerable amount in the wake of Trump's election. And this kind of mirrors what happened with DSA in 2016. The first time Trump was elected, DSA skyrockets to something like relevance. I don't know, people who are my age and older might remember the point when DSA was a very tiny organization with a very elderly membership, essentially existing only on paper, on the ghost of the credibility of Barbara Ehrenreich and Bernie Sanders having been members at some point. And in 2016, the organization transforms and really effectively taps into people's discontent and desire to resist Trump. But they do this by attaching themselves to the left wing or the left of the left wing of the Democratic Party. So ultimately, this strategy has the same fate as just joining the Democrats flat out. Another response that I've seen around me, I'm in an area that doesn't have a preponderance of left-wing organizations or even activist organizations, is what I'm going to call localism. It's a sort of liberal to progressive idea that all politics is local, right? If you really want to affect politics, pay attention to the school board, pay attention to the city council, pay attention to ballot initiatives. And some of those things are good. Some of those things are things we should absolutely be paying attention to. But the emphasis, the idea that all politics is local, that the real place we can make change is on the local level, has some flaws, right? The first is that it essentially surrenders the idea of national politics. If we're just going to focus on local, then how can we be internationalists? But also, how can we respond effectively to things that are happening on the national level? But this perspective, I think, is going to be strengthened in the near future by the success of, as Reed mentioned, ballot measures, for example, defending abortion, even in states that went for Trump. This would seemingly provide some proof for this perspective, right? But it's limited, and it doesn't lead us to uh, closer to our goal of building a revolutionary party that can challenge capitalism. However, I do think that the some of the things that this perspective points us towards interacting with are important. For example, ballot measures protecting abortion rights. Also, near me, there's likely to be in the near future some voting around homelessness and things like that, and those are going to be things that leftists should absolutely engage with, while not mistaking them for the whole political picture. Sort of relatedly, I'm going to call this, and I don't really like this word, but I don't have a better thing to encapsulate this, movementism. The idea that it is only social movements, only through social movements and in social movements that politics emerge, right? Making social movements the entirety of a political perspective. Um, so there's this emphasis on movement work and on organizing and protests and things like that. And oftentimes, especially recently and in more left-wing iterations, this involves waiting for organizational perspectives and organizations to emerge out of social movements, right? So the idea of, well, we don't want to come in and tell the movements how to organize. We're going to go in and learn from them what the best form of political organizing is. Obviously, social movements are co-optable, right? The Democratic Party has no difficulty over a long enough stretch of time bringing any given social movement into the fold, unless that social movement has its own organization, unless there are organizations willing to hold it up and defend it. Um, so rather than the perspective of just get involved in movements and support them in whatever they're doing, I think we actually have to be harder on our anti-democratic party perspective with Trump in the White House. Because as comrades have said, liberals are going to rediscover activism now, right? And they are going to be there and ready to slide the movement rightward, no matter how confrontational it may get. Briefly, I'm going to take a brief digression here into what I've written in my notes as Labor Party and then in parentheses Bernie's version. Um, you may be familiar with the American politician Bernie Sanders. Shortly after the election, Sanders came out and said that the Democratic Party had abandoned the working class and called for the formation of a Labor Party. Um, a couple of days before that, Bernie Sanders was making statements about how it was absolutely critical to support the Democratic Party because they respected the democratic institutions of this country. So whether you agree with Sanders or his new friend Dick Cheney, you had to vote for the Democrats. So somehow, in the space of 48 to 72 hours, for Sanders, the entire character of the Democratic Party changed. And I think that this harkens back to my characterization of him before as a sheepdog. I think this is a response to the very real potential for masses of people to leave the Democratic Party and trying to set up a little net to catch them on their way out. But there are more actual left-leaning calls for a Labor Party, which deserve actual serious discussion, which I don't think Sanders necessarily does. So when I'm using the phrase Labor Party here, what I mean is a large party that represents, broadly speaking, labor, right? So unions, usually I think people are imagining something similar to the Labor Party as it used to exist in the UK, supported largely by organized labor. And this is a development that we as communists, if a Labor Party came into existence, we would absolutely be stoked about. It would be a hugely positive development. It would demonstrate a turn towards more combativity in the class struggle, I think. And we would work with that Labor Party sometimes, and we would be opposed to that Labor Party sometimes. One of the things that a Labor Party, at least conceptualized like this, does or tends to do is represent positions held by large numbers of workers. We don't agree with all of those positions. And we're not going to agree with all the positions the Labor Party takes, especially if it had a real chance of winning a majority in Congress or winning the presidency, right? That would generally lead such a party to develop more conciliatory approaches. And I think that calling for a Labor Party right now is a little bit putting the cart before the horse. Which does relate to a number of other perspectives like this. There's an idea amongst organizations fairly close to Firebrand called infrastructures of dissent, coined by I don't remember who, but popularized at least in our part of the left by the book The Second Revolutionary Rehearsals. And this is the idea of building up working class structures that are needed to resist. Sometimes you'll have to see the example of German socialism in the early 20th century. They had all these social institutions, all of these unions, all of these kind of reformist parties that then revolutionaries could work within. So this perspective is saying, let's build those institutions. I think this is a mistake because those institutions didn't come about because a hardened cadre of communists, which is what we are at least aspiring to be, set out to make them. They emerged through the class struggle. They emerged through labor struggles. They emerged through anti-imperialist struggles. And so trying to set them up as a first step towards building our organization, I think is a mistake. Like with the Labor Party, if these types of mass institutions come into being, absolutely we should participate in them or at least relate to them. But thinking that we are going to be the people to take up as a primary task establishing a labor party or establishing these kind of institutions, I think is setting ourselves up for disappointment. I'll come back to that in just a second. Um, we may also see a resurgence in calls for a broad left party on the model of Syriza and Podemos, most recently in the aftermath of the movement of the squares and the 2008 financial crisis. And this is I think, a more palatable position, but still not necessarily one that we should jump on board with. Or in fact, I would say not one we should jump on board with, because the broad left party, similarly to a Labour Party, constituted of a huge range of left-wing political positions, right? From reformists to, frankly, progressive liberals to revolutionaries. And it shouldn't be surprising when contesting for state power electorally, which of those winds up in control, right? It is the wing of that party with the most capitalist-friendly ideas. When we've seen this in every place where one of these parties managed to win an election with the support of the far left. Syriza, of course, famously did nothing that the left hoped of it when it was elected in Greece, and so forth. But there is what might be a better version of this perspective, which is the idea of a revolutionary front or of a Marxist coalition to run candidates and campaigns. And this is maybe the first option that I'm laying out that we would, I think, have to take seriously and discuss whether we wanted to do it. If we had a number of revolutionary groups that stand for the self-emancipation of the working class and have a compatible perspective on elections with us. Um, this may be an opportunity that we would want to take. I know that our comrades in Left Voice have been talking about something along these lines recently. I think there have been a couple of other places where this idea is emerging, um, and this would be feasible, right? Because for the first time, this is a perspective on organizing that could help us build toward what we want, where we want to go in the future. Um, there would be a million questions to address, and I'm not going to go through all of them, right? But if we could find some kind of common basis for organizing, like a minimum level of agreement acceptable to all of us to mount an electoral campaign, this would be something worth doing in the electoral space, at least. But of course, our strategy and tactics can't be limited to elections, right? This has been what we've been saying all along. So when we're thinking about where to go from Trump winning his second election, I think we need to be prepared to debate with all of those electoral positions that I just laid out, or movement or local positions. Um, but our immediate tasks have to be things over which we have control. The establishment of a Labor Party is not something over which we have control. That cannot be our immediate priority. Right? Our long-term tasks are necessarily going to involve any number of subjective and objective factors, some of which are going to be beyond our control, right? That's the nature of kind of long-term revolutionary organizing, is you can't control everything. But we can control what we do right now and the next couple of steps forward, and making sure that we're pointing in the direction of a revolution. So one thing that we can control is what kind of organization are we building? And this is, I think, the main disagreement with our perspective, between our perspectives and the perspectives that I just discussed, which is that the kind of organization we want to be building is a class-independent revolutionary organization. We are not at the point of declaring ourselves, to be in the vanguard or anything like that. We are not about to storm the Winter Palace. And the organization that we're building won't exactly look like a mass communist organization in the future. But we should insist on certain characteristics that will enable us to build the kind of organization we need now, and make that the kind of organization that can build toward the organization we need in the future. So for us right now, I think that the two main points of emphasis that we should have is that organization is badly needed, and we need the working class to be organized. Um, and also that organization has to be fully and completely independent of the Democratic Party. I think those 2 points should be kind of the guide rails for navigating the coming period. Um, oh, good, there's another page. Good Lord. Um, so as we're trying to build that organization, we have a different take on organization than, for example, a liberal group or other Marxist groups. And we're looking at building a cadre organization that has trained, committed members, but we're also looking to have those members be involved in the struggle. So I think that our perspective, that part of our perspective, has not and should not change with Trump in office, but we should be ready to apply it to a new political terrain. Um, so, for example, I think that we should maintain focused interventions in social movements. Where we can and where we can effectively get involved in social movements, make the argument for socialist politics, try to win people and the movement to socialist politics. I think that's something we might want to pay more attention to after Trump has been elected, is on the potential emergence of community defense and mutual aid projects. This might be a little bit more contentious. Um, but I do think that, for Marxists have always said, or have long said about labor unions, that they are what's the phrase? The basic unit of working class resistance, essentially. Um, they emerge whenever workers need to defend themselves against capital. And I think that we could think about mutual aid projects, community defense initiatives in similar terms. They're not taking place in the workplace. They're not necessarily along, lines of production, but right-wing politics like Trump and his kind of billionaire coterie are putting forward produce a reaction from working people, and we want to be there when those emerge. So that would be something that I think Firebrand as an organization could keep an eye out for in the various places where we are. Is the shift potentially from people being interested in electoral politics to looking locally and so forth, and meeting them there. Um, and the other thing I think we should keep an eye out for that is new in a period with Trump, is to be ready for divisions between ruling class elements. I think we're in a situation that is very volatile for our enemies as well as for us. The appointment of a bunch of a particular segment of capitalists to direct federal office is a little bit different than how the capitalist class oftentimes prefers to conduct its affairs through at more of a distance. And I think there's a real chance that that development could hinder their ability in some ways to be as oppressive as they would like, but might also provide us with opportunities then to resist them. So on the one hand, the situation feels very different and subjectively on the ground. New kinds of political formations are going to emerge, or old kinds are going to be resuscitated. And I think we'll see a different approach or different perspectives on political organizing from the people we're meeting going forward from here. But I do think that what we need to bring to that situation is the perspective that we've been developing as an organization since we've existed, which is that we want to develop a revolutionary cadre in social movements and in our communities and workplaces, that can build for the future. And so maybe the place I'll leave this is that what we should be aiming to get out of organizing under the Trump administration is a more robust organization in Firebrand, but also a more robust set of connections to other organizations and to the working class. And I think that